welcome to a new episode of the SBE Podcast, the place where we share interesting stories of interesting people. My name is Louis Morgner, and today I'm joined by Jermain Kaminski, who is a PhD at our faculty and also an assistant professor and teaches different courses along the lines of technology, entrepreneurship, innovation, and also applied data science. In the past, Jermain has also been a visiting researcher at MIT multiple times and is also the co-chair of the Causal data science meeting, and also co-founded a company called Movie Galaxies. So today we'll talk about a range of topics. Firstly, about his personal background, which I'm super interested in. Also about the question how to succeed as a student entrepreneur, and also a bit more about the research Jermain is doing, especially in the field of using machine learning in the context of entrepreneurship. That's why I'm super excited. Jermain, thank you so much for taking the time and welcome to the show.
Thank you for the invitation.
Of course. So, Jermain, let's get started right away. Maybe let's have a look back into your journey to SBE and also to the things you're doing today, which is not only teaching, but also doing research and organizing a few initiatives. So, how was your journey from maybe your undergraduate degree to today?
Yeah, okay. So I did my A-levels in Germany. Like I was born in Wuppertal, which is, I think, 1.5, 2 hours from here, roughly. Then I went to Wittenherdecke University, which is a smaller private university in Germany, and very similar to Maastricht University because it was also founded in 1983, and it was the first uni having PBL. Yeah. So that was my first encounter with PBL, very small but radical university in many ways, and I studied there business and economics. So it was Wirtschaftswissenschaften, so that's 50-50. And after that, or during my master's and bachelor studies, I went 2 times abroad to MIT in Cambridge, US, twice as a visiting student. And then a third time as a visiting PhD, or visiting scholar, as it's called, at the MIT Media Lab.
Awesome. Well, so I think you definitely have some experience under your belt in the academic field. Maybe quite simply, why are you at SBE? Kind of what is your reason why you maybe ended up currently here at SBE and do the things that you do?
Well, the first is that I applied and was accepted, so I think that was the first reason. No, actually, I very much like PBL. I like also the teaching system plays a huge role. I like the Limburg area is very attractive, and the proximity to other tech clusters such as Aachen University, for instance, or Eindhoven. I think actually under-leveraged, so I still see an opportunity to do something in that regard. And so overall, like we have very early much responsibilities in our job. So it's a good growth opportunity to grow a team, to start initiatives, and overall, like that was the package that I think convinced me to go into academia and not to go after industry. At that point.
Awesome. Also, what I find very interesting, which is also dear to my heart, is entrepreneurship, but also technology in general, because we see it in so many aspects of our lives. And I think we also see the pattern of technology becoming one of the prime drivers for change in society, but also the world around us. So what fascinates you about entrepreneurship and technology as well?
Yeah, so the first thing is that entrepreneurship is always a venture into the unknown. That is also what the literature, I would say, concludes. And entrepreneurship is about building the world around us. So everything that you see here, that you experience, is an opportunity that you can change. Like that is also what Steve Jobs, by the way, said, is that everything around you was built by someone that is not smarter than you. Yeah, but it was a person, that had the stamina and endurance to change and build something. So whether you look into the technological equipment around us, or even the idea of coffee, or this room here, that was somehow built by someone that is entrepreneurial. So entrepreneurship for me means change, and in best case for the better.
Well, that's I think a noble ambition for many people, and actually, a question is also quite personal from what I see in the undergraduate studies, is that there's a lot of people and students who have great, bold ideas, great ideas on how to maybe reshape the world and environment around us, but they never really make the jump. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the first thing is it's good that they try. Because if you look into the statistics, the chances to have a startup or company that survives the first 5 years, the chances for that are lower than 20%, if you just look into the statistics. But it also highly depends on the environment in which you start and what you start with, and whether you are an expert on the topic, whether you really solve a problem that is out there. I think there are too many influencing factors that you could say what is right or what is wrong in that regard. But I would say starting at least, like, that gets you closer to success. Because I remember meeting someone in Silicon Valley years ago, sometime 2010 or so. He was in his mid-40s, and he, for a long time, struggled, like working on a kind of Google Docs, Google Sheets type of startup. And it was for a long time not successful until it got acquired by a Japanese company that then did an IPO. So let's say it was a very comfortable also financial package for him to sell the company. And he said, like, for 30 years, I had a life that no one wanted to have because I was an entrepreneur, and now I have a life that everyone wants to have. So, like I'm saying, there's always, when you are a successful entrepreneur, there are always very high costs that you can hardly estimate, but there's also very high reward when it works. No risk, no gain.
No risk, no gain.
Yeah.
It's the price you need to pay to play, I guess, in the field. You mentioned Silicon Valley, which I think is probably very different in some distinct qualities if we compare to the environment we perhaps find in the tech hubs in Europe, all across. What are some differences that you noticed if we compare the two?
So, unlike most people think, my experience is that Silicon Valley was very honest in judging ideas very quickly. You get very early feedback on what is not about to work. I myself, and I've seen also other colleagues, we have long time building products that probably no one wanted, or working on startups where we weren't sure whether it's actually going to valorize or turn into a business model. I realized that process goes way quicker in Silicon Valley, and that makes it, I think, a good place for really quick experimentation. And if you think back, it's no surprise that Steve Blank's lean startup idea came exactly out of that type of cluster. What is also particular about Silicon Valley is that you have a long tradition and history, from radar technology to Xerox PARC to nowadays Google and other companies. You have a long tradition of industry and academic cooperation and transfer. And you also have very good conditions for founders with ideas to switch from company to startup, and also to reinvest money they gain with an exit into the same region. I think that is what makes Silicon Valley very particular, that a lot of money and investment and also social equity that goes inside stays inside. And that is something that not every startup region has.
Mm-hmm. I think some very precise takeaways, also what I think makes Silicon Valley then a very unique place for the innovation and entrepreneurial initiatives that we can observe. Do you see a way for different tech spots and hubs in Europe to mimic some of the qualities that we find in America, for example, when it comes specifically to tech entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I think the first thought that you need to have is that it's not about mimicking Silicon Valley. Let's say, for example, the Munich tech area might have a lot of things that Silicon Valley doesn't have, meaning, for example, really high and deep tech. Silicon Valley is not known for deep tech, I would argue. Very much digital tech, at least dominantly. I think what Silicon Valley managed, and where the parallels are, and I wouldn't talk about mimicking again, is that they have a very good combination of technological and business skills. And we have a lot of regions also around the Netherlands where you have either or. But there are very few places, even not necessarily Amsterdam or Eindhoven or neither Maastricht, where both things come together, the creative and the technological class, so to say. And Silicon Valley, Boston, partly London, Paris, what makes them stand out, or Tel Aviv, what makes them stand out somehow is that they have a good mixture of the two. Yeah. So there was Eric Schmidt was the president of Google, as you might remember, and CEO for a long time. He was what they called did the adult supervision of the two founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin. And he said that you, for a good startup, like, you need to have the people with the business skills and creative people. Yeah.
So it's all about bringing people together.
Yeah.
This, I think, is a nice bridge to one of the initiatives you're also involved in, which is you're the co-chair of the Causal data science meeting. And I think there was actually a funny story you shared also in the beginning before we started this recording. So could you tell us a bit more how that started and what it is?
Yeah, so the Causal data science meeting I would already call a little startup to some extent, not only because it's a bit of work, but also how it started. It's a snowball running downhill right now, I would say. So the idea was really that we did some initial research, qualitative research, which was very new to all of us, by the way. Interviews with industry experts in data science all around Europe and the United States, companies you all know. And we asked them, what are issues you struggle with right now with your contemporary machine learning, artificial intelligence, whatever models. And they all identified causality is a pressing issue because all of the models they use, or many of them, they can't explain causal effects. So causal data science is highly requested by industry right now. If you want, like machine learning was requested 10 years ago, that now arrived, and it arrived with new issues. And those issues need to be solved. And for that, we also started the Causal data science meeting, 50-50 academia and industry partners from all around. And we thought when we started, probably 20 or 30 data scientists will join the meeting the first time online. And it turned out that 900 people attended online. And this year, the second time again, we were very happy because we had Guido Imbens, who was in the same year, last year, awarded with the Economics Nobel Prize. And as a keynote speaker, alongside Sara Magligiane, who's from MIT and IBM. And we had another time 900 attendees. So, or depending on how you measure attendance, we might have had 1,100. But let's say we attracted more than 1,800 people so far with the meeting, which is way more than we ever thought to reach.
Okay. And this is taking place on a yearly basis?
Yeah,
right?
Annually, usually every November. So what we also do is like here and there some workshops or satellite events with companies.
Okay, cool. I mean, that is a very nice link to the research you also do with machine learning and how you use it. However, I would like to delay that thought for just a tiny moment and talk about another key question that I think is very interesting and relevant to also a lot of students in their undergraduate degree that are listening and tuning in, which is really about student entrepreneurship. Asking the question, well, how can you be successful at founding a startup, a company, an initiative during your studies? And I mean, we could maybe even use an example. Let's call student Max, 19 years old, and he really wants to do something next to studies in the space of startups. I think we could talk about a lot of keys and principles, but let's really break it down step by step, maybe a bit. Where do you think should such a student really start this journey of launching a startup?
I think what is often underestimated in Europe and even in our own entrepreneurship education, and I don't just look at us, I look at many other entrepreneurship scholars as well, is that we underestimate how important technical abilities can be at the start sometimes. Let's say you don't need to study computer science for 3 years, I think, but it certainly doesn't harm if you know how to code front end or back end to some extent. So front end means what you see from a website, the design, if you want, like how the website is built up and how it works on mobile and desktop. And backend is a bit more complicated because that is about data storage, data processing, and potentially algorithms that compute things and so on and so forth. So that's also a bit more complicated part on the data or backend. But it never harms if you have talent in that because it helps you to evaluate what you need in order to get one step further. At least if you have a digital business model in mind. I mean, before I come further in the answer of your question, you may not forget that there are also a lot of brick and mortar businesses out there. So no one says that you need to start the next Facebook, Google, or Zalando. It's also perfectly fine if you start the next the next coffee store. I almost said coffee shop because that has a different connotation in the Netherlands. But it's like if you start the next, or pizza parlor around the corner. Like there's still things that you can do different. I mean, there was a lot of pizza out there before Domino's came. You can always do things different in scale.
What is kind of just started to also pop up in my mind was that I think inaction is probably the biggest obstacle to getting any idea off the ground, no matter whether it's a tech startup or a brick and mortar traditional model. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's so entrepreneurship is no commentator's game. Yeah, you can hardly be a commentator in entrepreneurship. I think you need to dive into it. And what I think is what we try to simulate in entrepreneurship classes is a very, very narrow view of what you can expect from entrepreneurship to be. Because what we do is we write essays, and in my classes, people sometimes produce a scientific podcast or write a scientific essay on the topic. Or you have final presentations that to some extent simulates working in groups. That's fine. But if you consider like what is the path towards entrepreneurship being a company, it's probably less than 1% of that. Because with a real entrepreneurship case, you don't need to survive for 7 weeks or 2 weeks in a group. You need to survive half a year, 1 or 2, depending on how long the runway is with your funding or whether you even get any. So it's a question of sacrifice very often. And I think what is also important is that the best way to experience entrepreneurship is really to register and start a company. Yeah. I have seen very few companies in my life that honestly started as PowerPoint slides or Keynote or whatever you call it, and neither as a business plan. There's a plethora of research in entrepreneurship that shows that business planning pays off. That's true. So some planning is beneficial for outcomes. Not the more you plan, the more successful you'll be, but the case that you plan already, that increases success rate. And also does entrepreneurship education and management education increases, there's a lot of research on that, survival rates of startups. So let's say it's beneficial, but finishing entrepreneurship classes doesn't make you an entrepreneur. 0.
Well, I think that's also a good gateway basically for what you mentioned with the technical capabilities also one needs if we talk about this tech class of business ideas that are getting started. Not about the next coffee location around the corner, but really about those tech-enabled business models that we see in this new digital world and the internet. I think it can be quite daunting for people to get into this because it seems like it's computers, it's something with coding, I have no idea about this. What are your thoughts about it? Is it really that hard to get started, or are there other ways maybe even to get your ideas off the ground on a product side? Yeah,
so I think the first thing is you need to know like what is my talent? What can I contribute to a team? And like when you are, for example, 3 business students that want to start a new startup, you even then or even more, you need to figure out what are our differences, so that we are really complementary. Like if you have 3 people that think alike, like it's not great for a startup. You need to have a certain, like a financial portfolio. You need to have diversity to hedge the risk, whether it's technological, strategic, business model, whatever. So that is certainly beneficial. You don't need to be a coder. There are also an increasing amount, and I think they're getting better, no-code tools from front end to back end. And no question, if I compare that to development experiences even I, as let's say a novice, had during my studies and school time, things improved a lot. I mean, back in the days, in the first version of our startup, like we had a dedicated server, like somewhere in the basement, actually running connected to the internet. Nowadays, you just launch it in the cloud, somewhere at Amazon, Google, or others, and even can easily scale at probably 5 or less % of the cost that we had. Yeah, so it's that experimentation with startup is getting cheaper, and so you have, for the equal amount of time and money, more ways and opportunities to experiment, not only locally but globally.
So let's take this argument a bit further. I mean, you could say barriers are going down. It's easier to get things off the ground, to build that initial prototype or minimal viable product or whatever you want to call this. What is the implication of things getting cheaper and also more accessible to more people?
Yeah, that you can scale quicker, and when it comes to data science, you can also analyze better behavior. I think the argumentation is often in that regard, like when we think about digital business models, how important is data? And there's this famous phrase of data is the new oil, but it's like oil. Like with oil, it is with data. You need still a refinery and then think, what can I do with it? Yeah. But the more data points you have, the more in behavior of your customers you can analyze, and the more you can adjust your product to their needs. Yeah, so there's this theory of the jobs to be done. I don't know whether you ever heard of it. Clayton Christensen, probably one of the most famous Harvard scholars in the management sciences, who said that a product needs to cover 3 dimensions. It has social, emotional, and functional aspects. But if you have a sufficient amount of data, even on digital platforms, you can very precisely analyze the needs of your customers and address them very well, those 3 dimensions. Netflix is a very good example for that.
Talking about then those perspectives we can take to think about our ideas that we have, and also considering that things are easier to implement and execute nowadays, I think an important question basically is picking the problems and ideas to work on. In other words, well, how can you pick a problem that really is worth solving? I think that is also linked to some of the aspects you mentioned, maybe with the Lean Startup from Eric Ries, about not working on problems that don't really exist or solutions that are in search of a problem. What is your view on picking the right problems to work on?
Well, you never know upfront whether the problem that you tackle is the right problem. You only know that later when you have a working business and customers that use your service or solution in any way. And that counts for normal business models up to medical problems. Yeah. So there are different ways to tackle that. And there's this kind of Y Combinator, Paul Graham, who's one of the co-founders, kind of view that do things that don't scale. So try to do things that no one wants to tackle, and try hard. A very good case for that is Airbnb. No one thought that a business model where you let strangers sleep in your living room on an airbed mattress and serve them breakfast the next morning would be anything that works. But as you can see now, with a lot of iterations and changes, it indeed worked and identified a blue ocean in that market. On the other hand, I'm a big proponent, also from my former PhD supervisors, Frank Piller, for instance, of lead usership. That's a theory that comes from Eric von Hippel, that was an MIT professor, that describes users that stumble into problems that then they solve themselves. And such type of innovators or entrepreneurs, if you want, so lead user entrepreneurs, they're very dominant, especially in medicine, in the finance business and sports, because there you often have high-end users such as surgeons, snowboard people, or day traders, I don't know, that are very much experts in their field, and they discover issues that no one sees. So if you want, they have a kind of infrared light for certain issues. Yeah, and when they tackle that, those startups are often very promising. So what I conclude from that is, when you want to work on something that people need, first look what you yourself might need or miss in your daily life.
Solve your own unique problems first, because that ensures product market fit to some degree.
Absolutely.
Something I heard from Ravel Ravikant, who's also an entrepreneur from America. Also I think it just brought up a parallel from a thing that I learned from Steve Blank, who's also, I think, famous godfather of Silicon Valley to some degree, where he talks a lot about customer discovery and also validation being the other very important component for startups next to product development itself. And I think there's also this pyramid. The best customer group that you can find is really the one that is actively looking for a solution and is already trying to create their own solutions to the problem they're facing, which validates and makes your life, I think, a lot easier when starting such an idea.
Yes, and what is important in that regard, and I think undervalued, and I've seen the value of qualitative research myself, and actually Clayton Christensen did a lot of qualitative research in Harvard with customers, from intercepting people at 4 a.m. in the morning in front of McDonald's and asking why they buy a McDonald's milkshake. They couldn't tell it from the data, but they found out that people buy the McDonald's milkshake to keep engaged with life on a long way commute to work. That was it. It was not the taste of the milkshake or because there were no alternatives, but it was the best thing in that moment, sitting in the car and keeping engaged with life. Yeah, and that is something that you only find out through really qualitative research. And startups, I can only say, or student startups, go out, ask customers, observe people with issues they encounter when using a product. I think that it needs more appreciation.
I think that's definitely a very practical takeaway for students or anyone starting their idea in some sense. Really working your way from the customer back to the product in a sense.
Yes.
Would you say?
Yes, absolutely. And I think a mistake that I myself did, and I see it repeatedly among students, but also other startups, is don't ask your friends and family and fools for feedback on your idea. They are not the people that will give you the honest feedback that you need sometimes. And it might happen that for half a year or a year, you're sitting on a dead horse because you thought everyone is telling you it is a great idea. If you have a nice father or mother, I assume they will always like your idea, no matter what you do. And you could propose probably chewing gum that tastes like beef, I don't know, and they will always say it's a great idea, even though you might not see the market right away. Look for honest feedback, yeah, and that you can encounter best if you talk to people that you don't know, so strangers that possibly can try and use your product.
Let's talk for a moment also about fundraising, because I feel like a common objection to starting to work on your idea, also from students, would be, well, I need a big, nice round of pre-seed funding, and nowadays we see so much money floating around in the VC space as well, which... Well, I don't want to judge it too much, but I think can be good or bad. What is your answer to that, saying, well, I need funding to actually work on that idea?
There are a lot of ideas that you need funding for when you want to or need to scale quick, yeah? But at the end of the day, as a founder, you always want to keep as much equity of your company as possible, whether you IPO in the end or not. I mean, you have a natural incentive not to have too much capital dilution, as it is called. And there might be other reasons than money why you want to have experienced and seasoned investors on board. Yeah, so investors that know how you can acquire and get talent, like coders, and from where, having a proper HR and compensation processes, right incentives in place in a startup. I think that is also underestimated sometimes. People that know how to manage visa things, how to get talented developers from other places in the world. I think that are the nitty-gritty things that good investors can help you with. You have a very bad investor if he or she can provide you anything beyond money.
So look for the value add beyond pure financial.
Absolutely. And I mean, if you have a large funding round, you never know what it means. I mean, you would hope that the valuation is proper, but especially the first round, it can always be guesstimates only, because sometimes you don't have sufficient revenue, so you don't know which evaluation method do we apply here. Is it discounted cash flow? Might be a bit too early. So how do we actually value a startup that is like 1 year, 2 years old, doesn't have sufficient number of customers yet? So valuation is always seeing the future opportunities. And that can be over and undervalued. So I would never go by funding rounds to say whether something is going to succeed.
Perfect. Well, that's, I think, again, a nice gateway to another aspect I would like to talk with you about. So if we consider fundraising, a common method that is also used by consumer-facing products is crowdsourcing or crowdfunding along those domains. You also mentioned earlier it is probably the most important aspect to work close with the customer and to really understand the problem from a very first-hand experience and not asking your mom about what the problem might be or how she likes your idea. So I feel like crowdfunding really combines those two elements quite neatly, and also your research is really focused on crowdfunding. So maybe talk a bit more about what you do in that space. So what are you doing in the area of crowdfunding?
First, general, the good thing about crowdfunding in the field of venture, the venture space, let's say, like in the seed phase or even before, is that with crowdfunding you can test an idea with the unknown people. Yeah? So not necessarily friends and family supporting your project, which can also happen, but must not. You can see how your product is received in the market and whether people actually pre-order. Yeah, so you produce a product in crowdfunding, and what people essentially do is they place pre-orders, which makes also good calculation for you because you exactly know for how many people you need to produce. Then in reward-based crowdfunding like Kickstarter or Indiegogo, you lose zero equity. Yeah, so you can raise up to $200,000-$300,000 sometimes without losing any equity. And there have been quite some successful startups in the field of wearables, like Pebble was a long way before the Apple Watch. Then we have a lot of 3D printing products. Probably 3D printing is the biggest market in crowdfunding out there, and without crowdfunding, it wouldn't be as big as it is. Then you have virtual reality. So Oculus Rift started on Kickstarter before it got acquired by Facebook. So there are a few examples. Same for the mini home do-it-yourself electronics market, Arduino, and so on and so forth. So it's a mixture of being very open, having a very open innovation process, participating people, but without losing control and equity. So a lot of issues that you would have in normal venture processes, early stage, you can to some extent delay with crowdfunding. And another advantage, the second I would like to touch upon more broadly, is that there's a science paper by Olaf Sorensen and co-authors that shows that crowdfunding enables venture innovation or the democratization of innovation outside the known hubs, like Silicon Valley or Munich or Berlin or so. You can, in Maastricht and elsewhere, get proper crowdfunding because people don't mind your location. They look at your product. And there have been a lot of successful crowdfunding projects amassing more than $200 or $300 million of the $4 billion that had been pledged on Kickstarter in locations you never heard of, Niagara Falls, or I don't know, that are the biggest locations for 3D printing.
So in a sense, also lowering the barriers again from a geographical standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it's a huge advantage.
Yeah. So what you're doing in your research, if I understood correctly, is basically taking machine learning and applying it to some degree to crowdfunding campaigns, to trying to predict the success of such campaigns.
Exactly.
Okay, so maybe can you dive into that a bit more? So what are you doing in your research exactly? And also, I think most interestingly, what are the takeaways? What are the keys to a successful campaign in that sense? Is that something we can already derive from that?
Yeah, so that was one bigger project during my PhD. So I was always interested into, let's say, time series modeling with Granger causality analysis, as it's called. I modeled that crowdfunding to up to 3 to 4 months can predict venture capital investments in certain sectors. In other words, the crowd runs ahead of institutional investors. And the next question was then, okay, like if I can predict the time series of that event, there might be reasons why that is a lagged effect. Yeah, how can I on project level make predictions? How can I, or to which extent can I, mimic human perception with an algorithm that then makes predictions on an outcome or a decision to invest? And so I took all text content from Kickstarter project pages. I automatically transcribed speech content from the pitch or product presentation. And I used also a video intelligence API from Google in that case to identify objects in videos. Yeah. And it turns out that products that are shown in the wild that implicitly also step further in the development process are more successful. And typical marketing, business, and slide pitches or illustrations instead of real product videos and animations are very bad predictors. On the other hand, showing students electronics, as I said, the product in the wild, and how it's being used are very good predictors. And it doesn't surprise you if you ever watched an Apple keynote, positive language. So when something is exciting or great, wonderful. So loading your presentation with positive language is very good for outcomes. So is it for startups. But it's important that you can signal that honestly. Yeah? So there's also research on honest signals by a professor called Sandy Pentland. Signaling your passion honestly is what some people in crowdfunding can do and others not, but you can do it way more convincing when you have a product to show. Yeah, and I have one more anecdote to that. So there are a lot of good predictors, so maturity of a product and how close it is to delivery. So you're more likely to get your crowdfunding product idea funded if you are rather close than far away from actual delivery. And when you can suggest people that you have technological expertise in the area that you tackle. Yeah? You shouldn't start a 3D printing startup when you have no clue and experience in the area, because the crowd, it turns out from research, is as good as professional investors to assess the quality of outcomes. That goes from arts to hardware. And by the way, technological female founders on crowdfunding are more successful than the male counterparts. And that is because other females especially support females in that alien domain and help them succeed.
Which is, I think, definitely a good thing to also bring that balance and lower the barriers also on a gender basis.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. What I'm super curious about, I mean, that was super insightful into how far the state of predicting outcomes is using machine learning, but machine learning itself, I think, is a very talked about topic. Please.
Yeah, I should say like the prediction accuracy is 72 to 73%. And I only to 50% can predict the successful startups actually, or projects, but with almost 80 to 90% accuracy, those that are not going to succeed. Yeah, so it's an average value in the end. But I can very well sort out the lemons just by using those three combined signals, text, speech, and video content. I only wanted to add that.
No, I think that's a very important piece to add. Yeah. But then sorting out the lemons, in a sense, talks about machine learning, because as you mentioned, you kind of develop those machine learning models who then help you in those tasks. So let's talk a bit about machine learning in general, because it is this big field everyone is talking about, organizations are talking about, and there's just a lot of things happening. So maybe for those who don't know machine learning that well by heart, also in the details, how would you describe to them where machine learning is today?
I think nowadays machine learning is mainly used for three tasks. So one is pattern detection, a second is pattern generation. So there's very interesting research on, for example, generative adversarial networks. So such things are used to create faces or voices or movie scripts, whatever you like. And then third one is prediction problems. And the latter is most prominent in industry. Yeah, so that you mostly have more or less structured data, and based on the data, you feed it into a neural network, to put it very simple, and then you can more or less come up with a linear or nonlinear estimator. Yeah, so you have a function that is estimating an output given an x-dimensional input. Yeah, so you have 20 images, and you can ask machine learning how likely is it that picture number 7 is a cat or a dog. Yeah, so that is essentially what machine learning is. And what it lacks, and that is the reason why we came up with the causal data science meeting, is it doesn't really know about causality. And I have a very funny case from my own research, coming back to machine learning. My machine learning predictor in my PhD told me that beer, cats, and women are very successful signals in a crowdfunding video to succeed. Yeah. So you have beta coefficients on a linear regression, and they were significantly positive. So why is that? Yeah, why should there be a causal effect between having beer or including a cat and having a successful crowdfunding product? It just turns out, looking at the causal mechanism behind it, very likely, that is not the cat that makes the project successful. It's more people that are very much in the internet community play with that meme of having a cat somewhere. And the females in the project were not successful because it were the founders, but because people used females to demo a product. Yeah. So you see there, machine learning might suggest you a complete different prediction than what is actually the underlying causal factor.
Is that also where you see machine learning headed, basically, currently, when it comes to research and also development of the machine learning algorithm itself?
Yeah, so there are three important factors in machine learning to take into account right now. PhD Carla Schmidt at SBE is also doing some research with Paul Hühnermund in Copenhagen and myself on that right now. So there are mainly three dimensions in machine learning that you need to consider. The first thing is robustness, that you have, as I just explained, reliable predictions. And the kind of cat issue can cost companies millions if you have the wrong prediction problem. The second is that you have no biases, especially racial biases happened. And there's a great documentary on Netflix by Joy Bola-Wini, whom I met at MIT, a black scholar who uncovered the racial biases of facial identification softwares from Amazon to the FBI. So really amazing work that she has done. And it's Code of Justice, I think, is the documentary called. Academic, it's the Algorithmic Justice League is the name of the organization. Please look into that. And the third thing is that you need explainability. And even regulators in the US, China, I don't know, but they are increasingly demanding that companies are able to explain how an algorithm came to a decision to assess whether there is some form of discrimination. Yeah, so is really the credit score in history of someone the reason why a bank doesn't issue a credit or bond, Or is the main underlying factor the reason that they live in a certain area and they're penalized because of other people's patterns, let's say? Yeah, so that is a good example, and I think this is where machine learning is heading. It will become more and more causal, and from the most recent economics Nobel Prize winner, Guido Imbens, to others, you can clearly see that causality is the big calling right now, and a lot of the people in the field would say, I think, underline that.
Okay, so I think highlights a lot of the also positive aspects we're hoping to see in the future, as you can tackle different also systemic problems you might have in a society, and I think that is definitely wonderful. How far, maybe that's a bit of a question of someone who's not as informed also about the details in machine learning, but how far do you think are we from this sci-fi general intelligence reality that is depicted maybe in a lot of also novels, but also documentaries or investigative pieces that we see? How far away are we from something where AI can really take over jobs that we right now don't even think could be taken over by AI?
That's really hard to say, because you need to look back like where machine learning started, and it started with Alan Turing in deciphering the Enigma, if you want. Yeah, and the idea of him was, and it's outlined in his 1945 paper that was titled The Imitation Game. There's a great game about it, which says that essentially that machine learning, AI, is about augmenting humans in a given task. That is why it's called the imitation game. It's about the computer imitating the human and not being any smarter than the human. Smarter in the sense that it's able to process more information in volume and time, yeah, but not smarter than humans. It's still humans building those systems. So I think that imitation game will stay for a long time. I think that is my conclusion. And you could see it very well. There was the documentary on AlphaGo by Google DeepMind, actually, that showed a human player playing against the world's best Go player, Lee Sedol from Korea, South Korea. And what he did there, despite losing 3 times against the computer, is he won one game by making a move that the computer didn't know. Didn't know in the sense that it was completely against all odds and all training data. He did something no human would do. So, and they later called that the God move. Yeah, the kind of God move, because it stepped out of all patterns. And I think we will see more and more of such God moves in the future. And what we see right now is, for example, people creating art that is generated. So the guns I talked about in the Sotheby's. But like with a good stand-up joke, you can only bring that once. Yeah, you can't do that twice. And I think we will see more and more of that. My hypothesis is, and our co-authors' hypothesis as well, that our human ability to reason, especially causally, will become more and not less important. And so there will be a replacement of the human worker in the production line and elsewhere. Blue and white collar doesn't matter. But especially the managerial capability to reason causally will become more and more important.
All right. Let's try to actually slowly wrap up also the episode today, and maybe just look a bit back also on what we talked about on the topics of entrepreneurship, but also machine learning. What is kind of, maybe let's start with entrepreneurship, because I feel that's also a bit more relatable to students listening. So what is like a takeaway you would like to share to that ambitious student who's thinking about launching eventually his or her own startup in the near future? Is there like one principle, one word of advice you would like to share with them?
I think the first thing is use the freedom that you have right now as a student, because there will not come many times in life where you can experiment that cheap. Experimentation becomes more expensive as you advance with life, with family and job and whatever becomes to that, because the opportunity costs keep increasing. And also university is a very good environment to find issues and problems in a field once you specialize. The second is, I would say, embrace chaos. I know it sounds a bit counterintuitive, but you know, in the old Greek, the idea of chaos was always something bad. Yeah. So ideally, like in the old Greek idea, the optimum is the cosmos, where everything is in order. And if you think currently about how your degree is organized, how you obtain a degree, all things are very much in a given structure. If you want, you are almost in cosmos. Yeah, you are so much in the cosmos that Netflix is even telling you what to watch next. And you can almost perfectly predict which course you are taking in year number 3 when you start boarding in year number 1. So I'm telling you, sometimes need to leave that cosmos and actively dive into chaos, also something out of your field, because as Nietzsche said, like it's the chaos. You must bear some chaos in yourself to give birth to a dancing star. That's a quote I often like to use because I think chaos and creativity are very close, and cosmos is not the origin of creativity that you need as an entrepreneur. And the last thing, and that is a message to the SBE students that don't see themselves as technological people. You don't leave university with a toolbox like many people do, like in the medical degree or physics. To some extent, you leave university and you know how to deal with the patient and what to do when X happens, what is Y that should happen, yeah? You don't necessarily leave with that toolbox unless you know Black-Scholes options formula in finance, or you know how to do certain accounting and marketing. But one toolbox that you subconsciously learn, and I think that is something that not many other fields learn that well, is a certain hermeneutic competence. That means that you are able to make connections between literature, that you are able to abstract business models, that you are able to connect certain literature streams on bricolage and effectuation, I don't know, and make up your own mind. But that hermeneutic competence to connect the things and reason for yourself and what it means for you, know yourself, what was written on the Temple of Delphi before university even started. Yeah, that hermeneutic competence, knowing what you need from that is probably the most important, and that is why managers will remain valuable.
Using your own mind.
Yeah.
In a sense.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. Jermain, thank you so much for all the interesting topics that we covered, also the insights that you shared, but also the principal and practical takeaways, for example, for student entrepreneurs. I think this can be quite a good starting point for people and students thinking about that. So thank you so much for taking the time. And for the other ones listening and tuning in on YouTube, I'm looking forward to see you guys at the next episode. So thanks again, Jermain.
Thank you for the invitation again. It was great.